action. Now that, it seems, is to be replaced by essentially the League of Democracies. This is the idea that somehow you can combine countries who are tied together by these shared democratic values, and this will override national interests. Well, just an interesting point. Shashi's own country, India, South Africa and Serbia, 3 democracies, voted last year against the human rights resolution at the UN condemning Iran, while Fiji, a military dictatorship, voted with us for it. So this translation, this easy idea that democracy translates into the backing of human rights in the UN is sadly not so straightforward, because there are indeed national interests which, if you like, prevail. And in that sense, sometimes I think it is the opponents of the UN who engaged in a more misty-eyed romanticism about how they wish the world was, and it's us, the UN fellow travellers, who are actually a bit more realistic about how the world is. We need a forum which brings everybody together. That doesn't mean that as democracies we shouldn't combine as a caucus around values to push for human rights and other objectives in the United Nations. But without that universal body, how on earth do we build a world built on the Churchill premise of jaw is better than war? Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. So now we turn to the audience, but before I do that, I'm going to give you the results of that vote when you were all coming in. Very interesting result. The United Nations is terminally paralysed. The democratic world needs a forum of its own. And incidentally, this debate comes to you with the support of the Rosencrantz Foundation. Now, this is how you all voted. For the motion, 336. Against the motion, 251. The don't knows, the undecided, 214. So clearly the motion could swing either way. Now, audience, I hope you're thinking of your questions. I will lump them in twos or threes. There's a lady there with the rather attractive pink scarf.
Sir Jeremy Greenstock mentioned that most of the people who worry us are not like us. I won't go on in the detail. Do we bomb them? What do we do with them? Well, I have to say that yes, that is what's being done today. We are being bombed. So why is the UN so paralysed, and why is it so ineffective, and why isn't it timely?
Thank you. And I suppose uppermost in your mind, Madam, is the recent conflict we've had in Gaza between Hamas and Israel. Is that right? Yeah?
Yes.
One of the examples. Okay. Another question, please. Okay.
Those opposing the motion have argued that the case for a global forum. For this to work, I think the democratic states need to play their part too. And so my question is, does the panel think that the US under Barack Obama will support the UN more fully, and what effect will this have on unlocking the UN's ability?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's go to you first. Sir Jeremy Greenstock.
Well, clearly there were huge problems of security and justice on either side of this argument. It's not going to be resolved this evening. But I want to put across a very simple rule of thumb. If people who are not like you, oppose you, are your enemies, if they have their own relative judgments to make, if they're capable of responding to an approach to talk, then talk to them. You can't talk to absolutists like Al-Qaeda, but you can talk to almost everybody else. Before the bombing started on the 26th of December in Gaza, there were indirect negotiations going on which could have led to precisely the same answer that we'll get out of this mess now in Gaza: no further violence, open the borders, think about talks to peace. That was available without bombing. Talk to people before you bomb them.
Okay. Robert Kagan, with a new administration, Barack Obama, do you think he is going to work with the United Nations and therefore perhaps make it more forceful?
Well, I don't know. He said in a speech in April 2007 what the Clinton administration also did, which was that we should try to work through the United Nations, but there will be some times when we have to make our own decisions. And I think that for better or for worse, most countries hold that view and act on that view. And this is the thing that I find when I listen to advocates of the UN, they fall into a certain kind of trap, which makes their argument easier to win, which is when things fail, it is because the member states have failed. When things succeed, it's because the UN has succeeded.
And I would just add, I mean, I really do applaud Bob Kagan for turning the argument on its head. I think the UN staff, when in places like this, do heroic work like the Congo. The problem is where it comes to the intergovernmental decision-making, where unless all countries are committed, it's hard to get strong decisions. And therefore, we very much hope Barack Obama represents a new chapter of American engagement in the UN.
But this is the theme here, is that if all the nations agreed to do something, we could do something. The problem is, and this is not just a temporary problem, it is a fundamental problem, which is all nations do not agree. And in fact, on many important issues, perhaps the most important issues, they're not going to agree. And that is why we talk about paralysis, because you're not going to get to that day anytime soon. And what do we do in the meantime?
Well, is the League of Democracies going to suddenly agree more magically on all of these issues?
No, and no one would claim that the League of Democracies, all democracies will agree on everything, but they may agree on a great deal. And would we not want to at least have that opportunity?
If the UN didn't exist, would we see a different outcome in terms of the ability of a concert of democracies to act on Gaza, on Darfur, on Iran, the various examples you mentioned?
Well, it's an interesting question. If you suggest that the UN, I'm going to stop talking in 1 second, if you suggest that the UN is the only font of legitimacy and you want to believe that, then the fact that the UN refuses to take action there does have a deleterious impact on the actions of other nations.
But if you look at, for example, what has been happening in Sri Lanka, where is the UN there? If you look at the 70,000 people who, according to Human Rights Watch, have been killed in Kashmir, and I'm not allocating blame in this. Where is the UN on that? And on Gaza, what is interesting is if you read the UN's Charter Article 2, all members shall refrain from the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. Where has that ever been applied to Israel? In 1948, 2 other UN members tried to snuff it out of existence, and earlier this year, and for some years recently, Hamas has been trying to bomb it and not recognise its independence or territorial integrity. So this is the problem. Where are all the UN members saying to Hamas loudly and clearly, urbi et orbi, to use a Catholic phrase, that you have to recognise the right of Israel to exist? It would be a nice start, wouldn't it?
I want to... Radek Sikorski, you've been awfully quiet in these opening questions.
Well, because I think the community of democracies can't solve all the world's problems, but it can solve some. And just on a point of fact, the community of democracies already works as a caucus in the UN. And my argument is that we should strengthen it, because I agree with the insight that on the whole, democracies do not go to war with one another. It is harder for them. Democracies are on the whole more peaceful because they have to respond to the needs of their people. Democracies are more averse to risk than dictatorships. And therefore, by strengthening democracy, we strengthen peace. And that's why the caucus of the community of democracies and the community outside the UN should be supported.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's just get some more questions from the floor.